like a Hellcat.
Hello and welcome back to the channel where of course it's time for another Sega Saturn review. Now today's review has been about 4 weeks in the making because I've made sure that I've played through this game from the start right through to the end so that I can give as detailed opinion on this game as possible. It was one of the very few PAL released RPGs. It came out in June of 1997. Over here I am talking about the one and only Shining the Holy Ark. Something I just want to point out is that most of this footage was recorded with my Saturn HDMI cable, but I have recently upgraded to a GBS control, so some of the footage later on might be at a slightly different screen size because some of it will have been recorded by that, and all of my future videos will be recorded via the GBS control unit because it enables me to display the screen at the exact size that it should be shown at. So the storyline for this game is pretty simple to start with. You take control of Melody Fort and the main protagonist Arthur as you've been sent on a mission by the King of Enric to capture the renegade ninja called Rhodey. Once you find him in the cave though, an unknown craft crashes into it, seriously injuring all of you. Rhodey, Melody and Arthur are saved by spirits and they possess them almost to save their lives, whilst Forte is taken over by an evil presence and he disappears out of the cave, and then the story unravels from there as you're on a mission now to stop the revival of the 1,000 Year Kingdom, which would take the world back to the Age of Darkness. So before we get onto how it looks, how it sounds, how it plays, what kind of lifespan it's going to give you, and whether it can make our Sega Saturn top 10, I just want to point out something, and that is if you're looking for an RPG that gives you a really detailed story with great characters, with lots of background information on all of them, something like Shining Force 3, or the PlayStation equivalent which came out at a very similar time to this, Final Fantasy VII, then you're going to be really disappointed here because the storyline throughout the game is pretty weak. There's not a whole lot of story progression in all fairness, and the characters have little, if not any at all, background information. The main protagonist, Arthur, obviously is a silent protagonist, being a Shining game, so he doesn't speak. He has very little character to him, and so it's very difficult initially, in fact throughout most of the game really, to feel any attachment to any of the characters because you don't really know anything about them in fairness, and it is a little bit of a tinged start to the review in all fairness. So like we always do, we're going to start with how the game looks, and thankfully Shining the Holy Ark is a reasonably good looking game. All of the character models in this game are pre-rendered, like the smaller ones on Shining Force 3, but they're of much higher quality. They're bigger, they're bolder, they're well animated, and they're actually quite appealing. The same can be said for all the enemies in the game. I think the pre-rendered visuals for all characters and enemies are actually genuinely good. Now the 3D graphics in the game are very functional at best. They're quite clean, they're quite sharp. The tunnels and the caves, they're all very straight. That's probably the best way to describe it, but there's nothing that's impressive. I have to be honest about it. This game is a very sort of functional, standard looking game. It's not impressive in any way really, and the 3D engine for some reason does suffer from slowdown as well. It's not impressive, it shouldn't be taxing for the Saturn at all, but you go through one of the towns, couple of the towns actually, and you get some major slowdown in these areas, and I'm not really sure why. There isn't really any excuse for that. In terms of special effects of the game, there aren't really any there either. I mean, Shining Force 3 didn't have a whole lot in the battles in terms of special effects for animations and spells, summons, critical hits, special moves. Nothing like that was impressive, and Shining the Holy Ark is pretty much the same sort of thing. Even the most powerful dramatic spells really look pretty tame in all fairness. There's nothing that's overly impressive visually. I am a part of the Sega Saturn Facebook page, and someone said on there recently that Shining the Holy Ark is the best looking 3D game on the system, and I'm going to have to just completely disagree there. The game looks functional, it looks clean, it looks quite crisp and sharp, but in terms of being the very best 3D looking game on the system, I'm going to have to pass there. So moving on to sound and music within the game, and thankfully everything that here is genuinely really good. All of the sound effects for your attacks, for all the spells, perfectly decent, very good, no problems with any of that whatsoever. There's nothing though overly dramatic. Like I said, there's nothing that incredible in terms of effects or battle spells, abilities, that kind of stuff. So there's nothing that really needs kind of dramatic sound effects. It was a little bit of a downside. And probably the biggest thing is you're going to hear the battle tune over and over and over again in this game. Now the battle tune is perfectly fine, but when you're hearing it every 10 steps inside a dungeon, it's probably going to start to get a little bit repetitive, and you will hear it a lot. Trust me, a lot. More than any other tune in this game, without a doubt. So whilst the music is fine and the sound effects good as well, no problems there, it probably just becomes a little bit repetitive. So moving on to the way the game plays, and this is probably the area where I've got the most to say, and it may well be the biggest strength of the game because the game plays pretty well, in all fairness. It's standard stuff in terms of villages and towns. You move around, you interact with people, you can find items, you can upgrade your armor and weapons. If you've got the correct items, you can go to the blacksmith who can make you more powerful weapons or items to support you, which is all good. The main part of the game is, of course, the dungeon crawling, and this is probably going to be where the game is made or not made for you. The dungeons are without a doubt where you will spend the large majority of your playtime in this game, so you're going to have a big strong stomach for random battles and repetitive corridors, because these dungeons are littered with both. A massive chunk of the game, probably over 50% of the game, is just spent in random battles over and over again, and none of the battles are that quick, to be fair. You can't 1 or 2 hit most of these monsters. You're going to be in the battle probably for a minute, 2 minutes every time, so it is really time consuming when you're popping up against enemies every 10 steps you take, and it can get quite infuriating, in all fairness. Like I said, navigating the dungeons as well is repetitive because they look very samey. You will find holes in the floor in lots of places, and if you go in too quick, if you run in, then you may well fall through a hole and you'll be put back quite a bit in the dungeon, and this can get infuriating. I would strongly recommend playing this game with a guide, otherwise it may well drive you insane, because some of the dungeons get so long, so awkward to navigate, that without a guide they are very, very difficult. So like most RPGs, once you reach the end of the dungeon or the area that you're playing through, there will be a boss, and the bosses can vary in difficulty quite a lot in this game. Sometimes you will get to them, beat them no problem. Other times you will get to a boss and feel massively underleveled, and you'll end up dying and going back to the town and having to get back to it again in the dungeon. So there is a little bit of variety and can be quite a bit of difficulty in the boss fights too. In terms of character progression in the game, it's quite standard stuff. They need a certain amount of XP to level up. The higher level you get, the more XP it takes to level up. Once you reach level 20 in your original job class, you can be upgraded to the superior job class, very similar to other Shining Force games, and this will open up new spells as you get higher and higher. So before we move on to lifespan and content, I want to talk about the 8 characters that you get within the game. You get 2 physical attackers who cannot do any magic spells whatsoever, just standard physical attacks. You get 2 ninjas, 1 an offensive one, 1 a defensive one. You get 2 tank style characters, 1 more offensive, 1 more defensive, and you get 2 mages, again a more offensive one and a more defensive one. So it does give you variety in terms of the abilities that each character learns. What you'll find though, once you've gained all the characters, is that you're relying on Arthur, Melody and Rhodey quite a lot. They're the standard characters that you start with, and they tend to be the ones that you keep in your team for most of the game. When you pick up Doyle and the Mithril Claw, he can do critical hits far more often, which is great, but that's his only plus point, his physical attacks. Once you've got Doyle, you'll never use Basso ever again because he just becomes completely redundant. And once you've leveled up the characters enough, you'll realise that Lisa becomes much more of a better choice than Doyle, because she can attack really strong and has a combination of magic spells too, meaning Doyle really becomes a bit redundant come the end of the game. Forte is picked up and he is massively underleveled. You really have to work at leveling him up, you do, to make him useful, and it won't be really until right at the end of the game in the final dungeon, when he's finally caught up level wise, that he's more of an asset to the team. So moving on to content and lifespan, and what you've got here in Shining the Holy Ark is about 30 hours or so of playtime if you manage to complete the game, that is. Of that 30 hours, I would say over half is definitely random battles, and another big chunk of that is just going through the repetitive dungeons. I'm afraid to say that is the large majority of the game, and that will put a lot of people off this game in my opinion. In terms of additional side quests within the game, there really is only one, and that is collecting all of the leprechauns, succubuses and fairies. If you do collect them all, you can get an item at the end of the game called the fairy bell, which can be used in battle, but that really is the only side quest in the game. The only other challenge really is if you want to unlock every single spell for each character. If you do, you're going to be over leveling your characters massively to be able to get to that point, because a lot of the spells aren't learned until 25, 26, 27. When you get to those levels, you're going to be far too powerful really for the end game boss. But of course, if you want to see all the content of the game, that is something you will have to do. Of course, the final question is, does this game make my Sega Saturn top 10? And this is a really difficult question for me. If you saw Sega Lord X's video a few weeks back where he did his top 25 Saturn games, he put this in there really high, number 8, number 9, obviously said it's one of the best games on the system, and I'm not really sure that I can agree with that. I find the game very repetitive, very repetitive actually. The dungeons don't have enough variety in them, and a lot of them you'll be in there for a long time, and it can really be draining on you in all fairness. The amount of random battles that you have to do to get enough levels as well to be able to kill the bosses. I think it's a cheap way to get content out of a game, forcing you to just keep leveling up in the dungeons, and it just shows a lack of imagination in my opinion of the developers of the game. So for me, looking at those games in our top 10, even Tomb Raider, Sega Rally in the lower positions, I don't think, on the whole, that Shining the Holy Ark is good enough to be in my Sega Saturn top 10. Now, I love RPGs. They are my favourite genre of game. And as biased as towards them as I am, I just don't feel I can say this is a better game overall than what the games in my top 10 give me. And it's tough to say because a lot of people say this game's brilliant. Some people have said it's the best game on the system. A lot of people have said it's the best looking game on the system. I don't think it's either of those in all fairness. So for me, Shining the Holy Ark does not make my Sega Saturn top 10. Now, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people who disagree with me, criticize me, tell me I don't know what I'm talking about, but that is something I'm prepared to live with. The important thing is, what are your thoughts on this game? How do you think this game compares to all the other games on the Saturn, especially the few RPGs that are on the system? There isn't really that many, and 2 of them are in my top 10, Dark Savior and Mysteria, and I think overall they are both better games than this. That is, of course, just my opinion. What are your opinions? Let me know down below in the comments, and as always, I will be back in the near future for another Saturn review. Goodbye for now.